Isabella of France's story is one of ambition, betrayal, and power, where a queen's fight for survival transformed the fate of an entire kingdom. Known as the She-Wolf of France, her name echoes through history not just for her royal blood, but for the fierce determination that drove her to defy a king and reshape England's throne forever. In the tumultuous and unforgiving world of medieval Europe, the great kingdoms were defined not only by the power of their armies or the wealth of their treasuries, but by the ambitions, alliances, and betrayals woven into the very fabric of royal courts. It was a time when the fate of nations could shift with a single marriage, a whispered conspiracy, or a well-timed betrayal. Kings and queens were more than just rulers. They were symbols of dynastic pride and political strategy. In such an era, personal ambition was rarely separated from national interest, and those who navigated these treacherous waters needed not only noble blood but a keen mind and a ruthless heart. Amidst this world of towering castles, lavish courts, and shadowy intrigues, Isabella of France emerged as one of the most compelling and controversial figures. Daughter of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs and destined to be Queen of England, Isabella's life would become a story of sharp intelligence, strategic marriages, daring rebellion, and ultimate fall from grace. To later generations, she would become infamous under the fearsome nickname, the She-Wolf of France, a title that evoked images of predatory cunning, cold vengeance, and relentless pursuit of power. Yet Isabella was not born a villain. Like many women of her era, her early life was shaped by the ambitions of the men around her. Her father, Philip IV of France, who sought to use her marriage to secure his influence across the English Channel, and her husband, Edward II of England, whose weakness and favoritisms would sow the seeds of her disillusionment. It was within this web of dynastic politics and personal betrayal that Isabella's true nature would emerge, not simply as a passive queen consort, but as a political force capable of defying the might of kings. Throughout her life, Isabella displayed a remarkable combination of intelligence, ambition, and resilience. She navigated the dangerous currents of medieval politics with a shrewdness that few of her contemporaries could match. She dared to challenge not only her own husband, but the very structure of English rule. She was a woman who could inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure, who could build alliances across nations, and who, when cornered, could strike with the ferocity of the She-Wolf, her enemies so bitterly named her. But her story is not one of simple heroism or villainy. Isabella's life was a tapestry of brilliance and darkness. Her rebellion against Edward II helped set the stage for the flourishing reign of her son, Edward III, but it also involved acts of cruelty and excess that blackened her reputation. Her relationship with Roger Mortimer, her lover and co-conspirator, blurred the lines between personal passion and political ambition. Her later years, spent in relative obscurity, suggested the loneliness that often accompanies those who grasp too much power. Isabella of France was born into one of the most powerful and sophisticated royal courts of medieval Europe. She entered the world around 1295, a daughter of Philip IV of France, famously known as Philip the Fair, and Queen Joan I of Navarre. Her birth was not just a family event, it was a matter of state significance. As a princess of both France and Navarre, Isabella embodied a crucial union of two major territories, and from the moment of her arrival, her life was set to play a role far larger than herself. In the corridors of power where diplomacy and dynastic alliances reigned supreme, a royal daughter was a living treaty, a chess piece on the grand board of European politics. Philip IV, her father, was a man of considerable ambition and ruthless intelligence. His moniker, the Fair, referred to his striking appearance, but behind his handsome face was a calculating mind that sought to consolidate royal power and bring the church and nobility to heel. Under his rule, France saw an expansion of centralized authority, an aggressive approach toward wealth accumulation, most notoriously through the suppression of the Knights Templar, and a heavy hand in European affairs. Queen Joan, in contrast, brought her own realm of Navarre into the marriage, adding lands and prestige, and was herself a sovereign ruler in her own right. The marriage of her parents thus symbolized both union and ambition, elements that would be imprinted deeply onto Isabella's upbringing. Growing up in the royal court of France, Isabella was immersed in an atmosphere of grandeur, strict decorum, and subtle political gamesmanship. The court was a place of dazzling ceremony, intricate etiquette, and hidden tensions. Here, from a young age, she would have been carefully educated not only in the conventional skills expected of a noblewoman, such as piety, languages, music, and courtly manners, but also, crucially, in the unspoken arts of influence, diplomacy, and self-preservation. Tutors and ladies-in-waiting would have schooled her in both the high ideals of Christian queenship and the practical realities of power. She would have learned how a single gesture, a well-placed word, or a strategic silence could carry immense weight in a world where appearances often masked ambition. Isabella's childhood unfolded against a backdrop of growing political tensions both within France and across Europe. Her father's consolidation of power had earned him many enemies among the nobility and the clergy. Meanwhile, international relations were often strained, particularly with England, a rival nation with claims and counterclaims that stretched back generations. In addition to these external pressures, the internal dynamics of Isabella's own family were complex. Her brothers, Louis, Philip, and Charles, would each at different times become kings of France, but their reigns would be short and often marred by scandal and turmoil. The Capetian dynasty, for all its outward strength, was already sowing the seeds of future instability during Isabella's formative years. The role of royal daughters in medieval Europe was simultaneously exalted and constrained. They were prized for the diplomatic marriages they could forge, but were expected to be passive instruments of their fathers' and brothers' policies. Daughters were educated to be ornaments of the court and pious matrons, not independent actors. Yet in this highly restrictive environment, a woman of intelligence and ambition could learn to wield influence from behind the scenes. From early on, Isabella would have been aware that her destiny was not her own to shape. Her marriage would be arranged for the benefit of France, not for love or personal happiness. However, within these limitations, she showed signs of a keen political instinct. Accounts from the time, while often colored by later events, suggest that Isabella was strikingly beautiful, possessing the famed fair looks of her father, but her real strength lay beneath the surface. Even as a young girl, she demonstrated an unusual poise and an ability to read people and situations astutely. At court, where alliances could shift as quickly as the wind, such skills were essential for survival. Isabella, it seems, was an apt pupil of the court's unwritten rules. Observing the successes and failures of those around her, she absorbed lessons about loyalty, betrayal, ambition, and patience. Lessons that would later serve her well, though not without cost. While most royal daughters accepted their roles passively, Isabella gave early indications that she understood the broader stakes involved in her future marriage and position. She was not merely to be handed off as a token of goodwill. She was to become a queen, a political player in her own right, representing not just herself but the interests of her natal and marital families. This early awareness of her value and potential power set her apart from many of her contemporaries. Beneath the layers of courtly grace, a sharper mind was already forming, one that recognized that survival and success would depend on more than beauty and obedience. Thus, Isabella's early years were marked by a dual education: the official training in the virtues of a noblewoman and the unofficial schooling in the darker arts of courtly politics. The very tensions and intrigues that might have crushed a weaker spirit instead honed her into a figure capable of navigating, and later dominating, some of the most dangerous waters of medieval European politics. Her childhood in the French court, therefore, was not merely a period of preparation for a distant marriage, but the forge in which the future she-wolf of France was tempered, her ambitions slowly awakened, and her talents meticulously sharpened. Isabella's marriage to Edward II of England was not merely a union between two individuals. It was a strategic alliance between two powerful medieval kingdoms. France and England had long, complicated histories, often marked by rivalry and conflict, but also by intermarriage and temporary alliances. In the early 14th century, political tensions in Europe were escalating, and Philip IV of France, Isabella's father, sought to secure his influence over England through his daughter. Marriages among royals were rarely about love. They were tools of diplomacy, a means to forge peace or cement power. For Philip, marrying Isabella into the English royal family offered an opportunity to extend French influence across the Channel. For King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, the match promised a powerful alliance with the French crown, essential for balancing his political challenges at home and abroad. The negotiations for the marriage were complex, involving not only matters of dowry and land, but also sensitive issues about political loyalty and territorial rights. The French were skilled negotiators, and Philip IV ensured that his daughter would carry considerable prestige with her to England, though financial wrangling over her dowry dragged on for months. Moreover, Philip used the marriage treaty to resolve ongoing disputes about the English holdings in Gascony, a region in southwestern France that had long been a bone of contention between the two kingdoms. When the final agreements were signed, they not only arranged the marriage, but also temporarily pacified an otherwise volatile Anglo-French relationship. Isabella was extremely young when the marriage was arranged. She was likely around 12 years old at the time of her marriage in 1308, although accounts vary slightly. In the medieval period, such a young age for marriage among royal families was not unusual. It reflected the urgency of securing political alliances while heirs were still very young. However, it also meant that child brides like Isabella were thrust into adult responsibilities while still in their formative years. Although consummation might sometimes be delayed until the bride matured physically, she was expected to assume the social and political duties of an adult queen immediately. Isabella's youth rendered her especially vulnerable, navigating the treacherous waters of an unfamiliar court, distant from the protections of her natal family. The wedding ceremony itself was a grand affair, held at Boulogne-sur-Mer in France. Royal ceremonies were lavish by necessity. They not only celebrated the union, but also served as a public demonstration of power, wealth, and influence. Isabella was dressed in resplendent fabrics adorned with jewels, symbolizing the prestige she brought from the French court. However, beneath the glamour lurked political tensions that would soon surface. Edward II's affection for his favorite Piers Gaveston was already widely known and created unease among both English and French courtiers. While the marriage symbolized a hopeful alliance, those present could sense the underlying discord. From the beginning of her life in England, Isabella faced significant struggles. Although she had been prepared for the grandeur and formality of court life, the English court differed from the polished environment she had known in France. In England, Isabella encountered a court dominated by factions, where favoritism, particularly Edward's deep attachment to Gaveston, created resentment among the nobility. Isabella, a queen expected to command dignity and respect, often found herself sidelined, particularly when Edward lavished titles, lands, and attention upon Gaveston, honors Isabella and her French supporters believed should rightly have been shared with her. Moreover, the cultural differences were striking. The English court was perceived by many Europeans as less sophisticated than its French counterpart. The customs, language barriers, and general roughness of certain elements of English aristocracy may have added to Isabella's sense of alienation. She also had to navigate the deeply entrenched hostility between her French entourage and the English nobles, many of whom viewed the French with suspicion and resentment. Despite these early setbacks, Isabella showed remarkable resilience. Even as a teenager, she displayed a growing political shrewdness, understanding how alliances and patronage worked at court. She began cultivating relationships with key English nobles who were disillusioned with Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston. Isabella instinctively recognized that her survival and eventual influence depended on building her own network of supporters. This capacity for strategic thinking, already evident during her early years in England, would later become one of the hallmarks of her extraordinary life. Edward II's reign was marked by deep instability, and at the center of much of this unrest stood his peculiar affections for certain male favorites. First Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. These relationships, heavily charged with political and perhaps emotional intensity, dramatically affected Isabella's life as Queen of England. Her marriage, which had begun with the promise of a strong Anglo-French alliance, soon became a personal and political ordeal, with Isabella often finding herself humiliated, marginalized, and forced to navigate an increasing. From the earliest days of their marriage, Edward's favoritism towards Gaveston was evident to all, including Isabella. Edward lavished upon Gaveston titles, lands, and extraordinary honors that were traditionally reserved for the queen and royal relatives. At the coronation ceremony in 1308, Isabella should have been the center of attention, yet Gaveston's prominent display and Edward's coldness towards Isabella were both public and undeniable. The French ambassadors and her own entourage, who had traveled to England expecting a queen's traditional status to be respected, were shocked by the visible neglect. Isabella, young and newly arrived in a foreign court, endured this slight with grace, but the experience left a lasting impact. It was not merely a personal humiliation. It also diminished her political power and prestige at a time when she was expected to establish her position as queen. Isabella's marginalization grew worse as Edward's favoritism deepened. Gaveston was not merely a companion, he was a central figure in governance, often involved in decisions that sidelined the traditional nobility. This caused widespread resentment among the English barons, who were insulted at being overlooked in favor of a foreign upstart of relatively minor birth. The political system, which depended on the delicate balancing of noble interests, began to crack under the strain. It was during this period that Isabella learned an essential lesson about English politics. Personal relationships at court could have devastating public consequences. The Queen's humiliation extended beyond court politics to her private life. Chronicles of the time, colored by bias but broadly consistent, suggest that Edward's devotion to Gaveston was intense, perhaps even romantic. Isabella, though politically astute, was still a young woman expected to play the traditional role of a royal wife, producing heirs and supporting her husband's rule. Yet she found herself relegated to a symbolic position, without the emotional partnership that might have softened her political isolation. This personal slight would fuel her later resentment and her resolve to assert her authority. The political instability created by Edward's favoritism was profound. The barons, led by powerful nobles such as Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, openly rebelled against the king's mismanagement and perceived corruption. The Ordinances of 1311, a set of regulations imposed by the nobles, sought to curtail Edward's ability to elevate favorites like Gaveston. One of their first demands was Gaveston's exile. Though Gaveston was briefly banished, Edward soon recalled him, defying the barons and reigniting conflict. The situation escalated until Gaveston was captured and executed by rebellious nobles in 1312. Though Isabella might have felt a private satisfaction at Gaveston's removal, the brutal political climate offered little relief. Her position remained precarious, and Edward's grief over Gaveston's death only deepened his political ineffectiveness. Following Gaveston's death, there was a brief period of hope that Edward might now devote his attention to governing properly and strengthening his bond with Isabella. For a time, it seemed possible. Isabella gave birth to her first child, the future Edward III, in 1312. The birth of a male heir enhanced her status, offering her new political capital and a stronger claim to respect at court. The English people celebrated the birth, seeing it as a sign of hope for the future stability of the realm. Isabella's role as queen consort became more visible. She participated in public ceremonies, undertook religious patronage, and tried to foster goodwill among the nobility. Despite these efforts, Edward soon fell into a new and even more disastrous dependency, this time on Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers, father and son, quickly monopolized royal favor, accumulating lands and titles at an astonishing rate. Isabella's initial hopes that Edward would turn towards her and shared governance were dashed. Despenser's dominance was even more resented than Gaveston's had been. He ruthlessly pursued wealth and power, often at the expense of noble families, and his aggressive tactics, particularly in Wales and the Marcher territories, stirred widespread rebellion. Isabella's marginalization resumed with a vengeance. At court, she found herself once again pushed aside, while the Despensers tightened their grip on Edward and the kingdom. Her humiliation was not only personal but also political. Despenser's influence extended into areas traditionally controlled by the Queen, including the granting of patronage and management of royal estates. Isabella's ability to reward loyal followers, a key source of any queen's political strength, was severely curtailed. She was made to feel isolated, powerless, and redundant. Yet Isabella was no passive victim. Even in these difficult years, she showed a growing determination to maintain her influence. She continued to cultivate alliances with disaffected nobles, particularly those angered by the Despensers' greed. She maintained correspondence with her relatives in France, keeping alive the possibility of external support. Isabella also took on public roles where she could, leading religious festivals, attending councils, and managing aspects of court life that remained within her reach. Though constrained, she carefully preserved the appearance of loyalty to Edward, biding her time. During these years, Isabella bore several more children, strengthening her position as the mother of the royal heirs. Beyond Edward III, she gave birth to additional sons and daughters, ensuring the continuation of the Plantagenet line. Motherhood offered her not only personal fulfillment, but also a form of political security. The English people had great respect for royal mothers, and Isabella's image as the queen and mother of the future king shielded her from complete political irrelevance. Nevertheless, Isabella's role remained fraught with difficulty. She had to balance appearances with private frustrations, maintaining a facade of obedience while seething internally at her treatment. Chronicles suggest that Isabella took pains to be seen as the model queen in public, pious, dignified, charitable. But her inner circle would have known her growing discontent. Edward, increasingly isolated from his barons and subjects, failed to recognize the danger in sidelining his intelligent and capable queen. By the mid-1320s, tensions in England were reaching a breaking point. The Despencer's unpopularity was at an all-time high, rebellions were breaking out in the marches, and Edward's authority was widely questioned. Isabella's personal suffering mirrored the nation's broader political crisis. She had learned through painful experience that court life under Edward II was treacherous, and that survival depended on patience, alliances, and readiness to act. The seeds of Isabella's future rebellion were planted in these years of humiliation and exclusion. Her knowledge of court politics, her experience in diplomacy from her upbringing, and her personal grievances all coalesced into a steely resolve. Though she continued to play the dutiful queen for the time being, those around her, both her friends and her enemies, could not have failed to notice that Isabella was a woman of formidable spirit and intelligence. England's troubled queen was quietly preparing for the day when she would seize her destiny. Isabella of France, Queen of England, found herself increasingly alienated in the court of Edward II as the influence of Hugh Despencer the Younger and his father, Hugh Despencer the Elder, deepened. Originally, her marriage had been strained by Edward's devotion to his favorite, Piers Gaveston, whose presence was a persistent source of humiliation for Isabella. After Gaveston's fall and execution, there had been a brief hope that Isabella might enjoy a more central role. However, the arrival of the Despensers at court only worsened her situation. They quickly became Edward's new favorites, and unlike Gaveston, they harbored deep ambitions not just for influence but for outright control of royal power. Their ascendancy resulted in the queen's marginalization and a progressive erosion of her status, both publicly and privately. Isabella's relationship with the Despensers was tense from the outset. Hugh Despencer the Younger, in particular, viewed her as a potential threat to his dominance over the king. A calculating and ruthless figure, he worked tirelessly to cut her off from sources of influence. Small slights grew into larger indignities. Isabella, once celebrated for her grace and royal heritage as daughter of the mighty King Philip IV of France, now found herself slighted at court ceremonies, denied funds that were traditionally at the Queen's disposal, and watched closely by Despencer allies. Her household was infiltrated by spies, her correspondence monitored, and her movements restricted under the guise of protecting her safety. Behind this personal animosity lay larger political stakes. The Despensers' accumulation of wealth and land at the expense of the barons caused widespread resentment among the nobility. They ruthlessly exploited royal patronage, seizing estates, enforcing dubious legal claims, and punishing those who resisted. Edward, infatuated with Hugh Despencer's companionship and political advice, permitted these abuses. The realm groaned under the weight of Despencer tyranny, and many barons who might once have remained loyal to the crown found themselves disenfranchised and embittered. Isabella recognized that her survival depended on navigating this volatile court. Initially, she attempted diplomacy, aligning herself discreetly with discontented noblemen who also suffered under Despencer domination. Her alliances were cautious at first, shrouded in secrecy. She understood that an overt challenge to Edward and his favorites could provoke a backlash, leading to the loss of what little power she retained. With calculated charm and royal prestige, Isabella reached out to old allies from among the English barons, leveraging shared grievances and whispered promises of change. Despite her efforts, Edward's attitude toward Isabella hardened. Under Despencer's influence, he grew increasingly suspicious and antagonistic toward his own wife. The final insult came when Edward, flouting both custom and decency, confiscated some of Isabella's personal lands and revenues, an extraordinary act of aggression toward the queen. Properties traditionally assigned to the queen consort for her maintenance, including the lucrative earldom of Cornwall revenues and several castles, were stripped from her control and reassigned to Despencer allies. Isabella, now deprived of independent resources, was placed in an untenable position. She was still queen, but she had no financial autonomy, no political influence, and no security apart from what Edward and his favorites chose to grant her. It became painfully clear to Isabella that diplomacy alone would not restore her standing. For years she had played the role of the dutiful wife, enduring public humiliation with regal restraint. But the system that supported her queenship was crumbling. Edward's regime, increasingly tyrannical, had alienated the nobility and oppressed the broader populace. Even the church, traditionally a stabilizing force, murmured against the dispenser tyranny. In the halls of power, discontent simmered, waiting for a spark. The first significant opportunity presented itself when diplomatic negotiations arose between England and France. Tensions over the Duchy of Gascony, a vital English holding in southwestern France, had reached a critical point. King Charles IV of France, Isabella's brother, summoned Edward to pay homage for his French lands. Edward, unwilling to leave England where his power was fragile, sent Isabella instead, trusting that as a daughter of France and Queen of England, she would secure a favorable outcome. It was a fatal miscalculation. Isabella's journey to France under the pretext of negotiation was a turning point. Freed from dispenser surveillance and Edward's immediate authority, she was able to reassert herself politically. Once in France, Isabella shed the veneer of submissive diplomacy she had worn in England. She dressed regally, carried herself with undeniable majesty, and was warmly received at her brother's court. Charles IV, sympathetic to his sister's plight and contemptuous of Edward's feeble kingship, offered her protection. In an audacious move, Isabella refused to return to England after her diplomatic mission was complete. She claimed that she feared for her safety at the hands of the dispensers, and more subtly, implied that Edward's continued enthrallment to corrupt favorites endangered the kingdom itself. This act of defiance electrified political circles on both sides of the Channel. In England, the court was thrown into chaos. Edward and the dispensers railed against Isabella's treachery, attempting to discredit her, but their anger only underscored their growing vulnerability. In France, Isabella began building a network of allies. English exiles who had fled dispenser oppression flocked to her cause, including some of the kingdom's most prominent and capable figures. Among them was Roger Mortimer, a once powerful Marcher lord who had escaped imprisonment and exile under the dispenser regime. Mortimer and Isabella found in each other both political alignment and a profound personal bond that would shape the course of English history. French nobles, ever eager to meddle in English affairs and diminish Plantagenet power, offered quiet support. Charles IV, while cautious not to provoke outright war, allowed his sister the freedom to act and provided a safe haven for her burgeoning rebellion. Isabella's growing network of allies expanded quickly. Discontented English barons, bitter exiles, and opportunistic knights rallied under her banner, drawn by the promise of liberation from dispenser tyranny and the hope of restoring traditional noble rights. Isabella's campaign was as much symbolic as it was political. By positioning herself as the champion of English liberties against despotism, she appealed to deep-seated cultural ideals. The narrative she crafted painted Edward not simply as a negligent husband, but as a king who had betrayed his sacred trust to the realm. Her refusal to return to England became a living symbol of resistance, a queen taking a stand against corruption and injustice. As weeks turned into months, Isabella and Mortimer carefully laid the groundwork for a full-scale invasion. They negotiated with potential allies in England, coordinated with sympathetic forces on the continent, and secured financial and military support. Isabella even arranged a politically advantageous marriage between her son, the young Prince Edward, and the daughter of Count William I of Hainaut, promising her military assistance in return. With this union, Isabella ensured she had the necessary forces to mount a credible challenge. Throughout this period, Isabella maintained a masterful balancing act. She presented herself as a wronged queen seeking justice, careful to emphasize her loyalty to the institution of monarchy even as she plotted the overthrow of her husband's regime. Her careful cultivation of alliances, manipulation of political symbols, and strategic use of personal and dynastic ties reveal a figure of immense political acumen. In England, meanwhile, Edward's position weakened daily. The baronage was restless, the population increasingly resentful, and the dispenser's arrogance continued to alienate even potential allies. Rumors of Isabella's preparations spread, stoking fears and hopes in equal measure. Edward's desperate attempts to rally support only exposed his growing isolation. By the time Isabella set sail for England in 1326, accompanied by Mortimer and a modest but highly motivated force, she was not simply a renegade queen, but a political force capable of reshaping the kingdom. Her campaign was swift and effective. Towns opened their gates to her, barons defected to her cause, and Edward, abandoned by all but his most loyal retainers, was forced to flee. Isabella's journey from marginalized queen to the architect of rebellion reveals a remarkable story of resilience, strategy, and transformation. What began as private discontent at personal humiliation evolved into a revolutionary movement against tyranny. In the space of a few years, Isabella went from a powerless figure at the mercy of the dispensers to the commanding leader of a coalition that would bring down a king. This extraordinary period in Isabella's life illustrates the intersection of personal grievance and political opportunity. Her experiences at the English court sharpened her understanding of power, its abuses, and its vulnerabilities. Her time in France demonstrated her capacity for strategic thinking and alliance building, and her defiance of Edward II reshaped not only her own destiny, but the future of the English monarchy itself. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the silent humiliations of court, in the whispered alliances of the disaffected, and in the patient, deliberate steps Isabella took once she recognized that diplomacy was no longer enough. Her journey to France, ostensibly a mission of peace, became the launching point for a revolution. The symbolic power of her refusal to submit to Edward's authority reverberated across Europe, inspiring admiration, fear, and awe. Ultimately, Isabella's story in these years is not merely a tale of personal vengeance or marital breakdown. It is the story of a woman who, forced by circumstance into political exile, used every tool at her disposal: family connections, personal charisma, diplomatic skill, and military strategy, to challenge a corrupt regime and alter the course of history. Her growing discontent transformed into determined action, and her rebellion sowed the seeds for a new era in English governance, one that would grapple with the balance between royal authority and the rights of the nobility for generations to come. Roger Mortimer's name had long been known in England as a man of ambition, daring, and deep resentment toward Edward II and his favorites, the Despensers. Mortimer hailed from a powerful Marcher family that had guarded the turbulent borders between England and Wales for generations. His lineage gave him the military skills and political cunning that were vital in a world ruled by alliances, betrayals, and battles for dominance. Initially, Mortimer had served Edward loyally, even fighting on behalf of the crown in Wales and Scotland. However, the king's growing favoritism toward Hugh Despenser the Younger and the Despenser family alienated many nobles, including Mortimer, whose lands and influence suffered under their monopolistic ambitions. His disillusionment turned into rebellion when Edward, increasingly reliant on the Despensers, treated even his most prominent lords with open disdain. Mortimer's rebellion in 1321, along with other Marcher lords, ended in failure. Captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, Mortimer's future appeared grim. The tower, with its thick stone walls and iron bars, was considered nearly inescapable. Yet Mortimer's spirit was far from broken. He carefully cultivated friendships and bribed key individuals within the tower's staff, sowing seeds of trust and treachery alike. His escape in 1323 was a masterpiece of timing and daring. Disguised and aided by sympathizers, Mortimer fled London and made his way across the English Channel to France, eluding Edward's furious efforts to recapture him. In France, Mortimer's path converged with that of Queen Isabella, whose position had become increasingly desperate. Isabella, once the dutiful wife and queen, had suffered deeply at Edward's hands, her lands seized, her household dismantled, and her dignity stripped by the rise of the Despensers. Sent to France ostensibly to negotiate peace with Isabella's brother, King Charles IV of France, she had seized the opportunity to defy her husband. Once in France, Isabella refused to return, using the diplomatic mission as cover for building alliances against Edward. When Mortimer arrived in France, it was as if two wounded lions had found one another, each nursing grievances, each yearning for vengeance, and each recognizing in the other a kindred spirit. Their alliance was more than political. It was deeply personal. Over the months that followed Mortimer's arrival, he and Isabella's relationship grew intimate. Contemporary chroniclers hinted at the scandalous nature of their bond, but whether their affection began before or after their political collaboration remains clouded in mystery. What is certain is that their partnership revitalized both their ambitions. Isabella found in Mortimer not only a trusted ally, but also a man willing to act where others hesitated. Mortimer, in turn, discovered in Isabella the legitimacy and royal connection he needed to make a serious bid for power. Their plans to overthrow Edward II were not impulsive, but carefully laid out. In the elegant courts of France, hidden behind the veils of diplomacy and royal hospitality, Isabella and Mortimer spun a web of conspiracy. They reached out to the exiled English lords, many of whom had been driven from England by the Despencer's ruthless campaigns. These displaced nobles, bitter and desperate to reclaim their lands and honor, proved eager recruits. Among them were Thomas Wake, Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and other powerful figures who recognized that Isabella and Mortimer offered the best hope of restoring balance to a kingdom teetering on the edge of tyranny. Meanwhile, Isabella was working to secure the political backing of her brother, King Charles IV. Though cautious, Charles saw the advantage in weakening Edward II's position, especially after repeated diplomatic slights. Isabella secured some measure of French support, enough to provide her sanctuary and the freedom to plan her moves. Through careful negotiations, bribes, and promises of future rewards, she and Mortimer also arranged financial backing from merchants and sympathetic nobles. Money was crucial. Armies could not be raised, ships could not be hired, and loyalty could not be bought without a steady flow of gold. One of Isabella's boldest moves was securing the betrothal of her young son, Edward of Windsor, to Philippa of Hainaut, daughter of a powerful continental count. The marriage contract came with promises of military aid. Philippa's father agreed to provide troops and ships, not merely as an act of friendship, but as part of a calculated gamble to expand his influence in England. Isabella's ability to use her son as a political pawn demonstrated her shrewd understanding of medieval realpolitik. Though it meant separating the young Edward from his father's grasp, it also provided her with the figurehead she needed, a rightful heir around whom the rebellion could rally. By mid-1326, preparations were almost complete. In secret meetings held in the smoky halls of Parisian taverns, in the gilded rooms of sympathetic nobles, and under the open skies of secluded French countryside, Isabella and Mortimer crafted their invasion plan. They would land in England with a modest force, but would count on widespread support from disaffected barons and commoners alike. Word was sent ahead to their English allies, urging them to be ready to rise up as soon as the Queen set foot on English soil. Each step was risky. Spies lurked everywhere, and betrayal could mean death. Edward's agents in France sniffed around, reporting back to the king, but Isabella's careful masking of her true intentions kept them from uncovering the full scope of the plot. Isabella and Mortimer knew the strength of their cause lay not merely in numbers, but in the righteousness of their grievance. They portrayed themselves not as rebels against lawful authority, but as liberators against tyranny and corruption. Propaganda was subtly spread. Edward had abandoned his kingly duties. The Despensers were wicked usurpers. The Queen was acting for the good of the realm and the safety of her son, the future king. The moral framing of their rebellion was essential in a society where divine right and loyalty to the crown were deeply ingrained. The emotional and psychological burden during these months must have been immense. Isabella, once isolated and humiliated in England, was now at the center of a political maelstrom, carrying not only her personal hopes, but the aspirations of many displaced nobles and discontented subjects. Mortimer, a man marked for death should their plans fail, operated with the fierce intensity of someone with nothing to lose, but everything to gain. Their relationship, both tender and volatile, endured the strains of secrecy, fear, and relentless preparation. In the late summer of 1326, as the winds began to shift and the leaves prepared to fall, Isabella and Mortimer finalized their preparations. Their forces, while modest in number compared to a full royal army, were seasoned, determined, and backed by the expectation of mass defections once they landed. Ships were secretly hired, arms were gathered, and horses prepared. The invasion would be swift, targeted, and above all symbolic. They aimed not merely to defeat Edward's forces, but to shatter the image of his invincibility, to tear down the edifice of power that the Despensers had so meticulously constructed. As they boarded their ships, setting sail for the English coast, both Isabella and Mortimer must have known that there was no turning back. Success would mean glory, power, and the redemption of their names. Failure would mean exile at best, execution at worst. Yet neither hesitated. Their gamble was fueled by desperation, ambition, love, and an acute understanding of the political moment. England was ripe for change, and they intended to be the instruments of that change. Their journey to reclaim England began, not merely with armies and arms, but with a union of two indomitable wills, forged in betrayal, tempered in exile, and driven by a shared vision of a kingdom restored. The bold and audacious plan that Isabella and Roger Mortimer conceived in exile would now move from secret meetings and promises to action. For months, Isabella had engaged in careful diplomacy, reaching out to various foreign courts for support. Her time in France, combined with her royal lineage as the daughter of King Philip IV, afforded her considerable influence among European nobility. She skillfully leveraged these connections, presenting herself not merely as a disgruntled queen, but as a rightful savior of England from a king who had led the country into ruin and disgrace. The court of her brother, King Charles IV of France, proved an initial haven, though he stopped short of offering direct military support. Nevertheless, Isabella's marriage ties and the goodwill she fostered allowed her to recruit soldiers and secure safe passages. In Flanders, Isabella found a particularly valuable ally. William I, Count of Hainaut, was receptive to her overtures, especially after she arranged the betrothal of her son, Prince Edward, to William's daughter, Philippa. This marriage alliance was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. It promised William a future kinship with the English throne and gave Isabella access to critical military resources. Moreover, the dowry agreed upon in this arrangement helped fund the invasion, providing her and Mortimer with much-needed financial support. Through careful negotiation and promises of reward, Isabella and Mortimer pieced together a modest but determined fighting force, composed of mercenaries, exiled Englishmen loyal to her cause, and Flemish soldiers. Despite their relatively small numbers, the invading army was bolstered by the strategic brilliance and desperation that characterized Isabella's leadership. As the preparations concluded, the risks of the mission were clear to all involved. Invading England with a small force would require precision, speed, and above all, a widespread popular uprising against Edward II. Isabella and Mortimer were counting on the deep discontent that had been brewing among the English barons and commoners alike. The memory of Edward's favoritism toward the Despensers, his reckless policies, and military failures had created fertile ground for rebellion. The situation in England was tense. The king's enemies were many, but fear of royal reprisal had kept them in check, until now. In September 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and their assembled forces landed on the coast of Suffolk. They chose this location carefully. Suffolk was a region known for its opposition to the Despensers, and they hoped to rally the local population quickly. Their gamble paid off. Almost immediately after landing, they were joined by sympathetic barons, disillusioned knights, and commoners emboldened by the presence of Prince Edward, who symbolized the legitimate continuation of the Plantagenet line. Towns opened their gates without resistance. Local lords offered their castles and resources. It became clear that Isabella and Mortimer had not only launched an invasion, but had sparked a nationwide revolt. Their success was rapid and overwhelming. Word spread like wildfire that the Queen had returned to liberate the realm, and with every mile they advanced, their numbers swelled. Edward II, who had been residing with Hugh Despenser the Younger and his loyalists, was slow to react. He failed to muster a coherent defense, largely because the nobility either refused to answer his call or actively defected to Isabella's side. The Despensers, whose tyranny had bred so much resentment, found themselves isolated. Edward's repeated misjudgments during his reign had eroded the traditional loyalties of his subjects, and now, faced with a genuine alternative, they abandoned him. The collapse of Edward II's support network was swift and devastating. In London, traditionally a royal stronghold, riots broke out. The citizens, infuriated by years of mismanagement and suffering under royal exactions, declared openly for Isabella. The Tower of London itself came under siege by the city's inhabitants, demonstrating just how complete the disaffection had become. No longer could Edward rely on the traditional machinery of monarchy to preserve his rule. Even some members of the clergy and senior government officials, sensing the shifting winds, pledged allegiance to the Queen. Fleeing from the encroaching forces, Edward and the Despensers moved westward, seeking refuge in Wales where Despenser had familial estates and a dwindling power base. Their retreat was chaotic and desperate. Supplies ran short, morale crumbled. Pursued relentlessly by Isabella's forces, Edward was gradually hemmed in. The image of a king on the run, abandoned by his most powerful allies, sealed his fate in the eyes of the nation. At every turn, Edward's situation grew more hopeless. His authority, once symbolized by the great royal standard, now amounted to little more than a handful of frightened loyalists fleeing from their own people. In late 1326, Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger were finally captured in South Wales. Their apprehension marked the final act of a drama that had enthralled and horrified the English public. Edward, once the anointed king, now appeared as a pathetic figure, betrayed and imprisoned by the very institution he had once commanded. Despenser's fate was brutal. He was subjected to a ritualistic execution that reflected the deep hatred the populace bore toward him. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a gruesome spectacle meant as both justice and warning. Edward, however, faced a different path. Isabella and Mortimer, while determined to remove him from power, recognized the dangers of executing an anointed king outright. Such an act could provoke divine condemnation and rebellion from more conservative elements within England and abroad. Instead, they orchestrated a forced abdication, framing it as a voluntary surrender of power in favor of his son. In January 1327, Edward II was compelled to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, who would be crowned Edward III. The abdication was a carefully stage-managed affair. Parliament, summoned in an unprecedented manner, was presented with a document in which Edward allegedly acknowledged his own unfitness to rule and consented to the transfer of power. Whether Edward understood or even agreed to the full implications remains a matter of historical debate, but the outcome was clear. For the first time in English history, a monarch had been formally deposed by a combination of parliamentary and military action, setting a precedent that would echo through subsequent centuries. After the abdication, Edward II was placed in captivity, moved from castle to prevent any rescue attempts by lingering loyalists. His fate, however, was sealed. Though he remained alive for a time, the threat he posed to Isabella and Mortimer's new regime was too great to ignore. In September 1327, under mysterious circumstances, Edward II died while imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. Rumors of foul play, including suggestions that he had been murdered with horrific cruelty, spread rapidly. Whether or not he was directly assassinated on Isabella and Mortimer's orders, his death removed the final obstacle to their control of England. The invasion, which had begun as a desperate gamble with a small mercenary force, had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. Isabella and Mortimer emerged as the true rulers of England, acting as regents for the young Edward III. Their success was a testament not only to their political and military acumen, but to the profound failures of Edward II's reign. In the eyes of many contemporaries, Isabella's actions were justified by necessity and divine favor. In the eyes of others, she had overstepped the bounds of a queen's traditional role. Regardless, the balance of power had shifted dramatically, and England would never be the same. Yet beneath the triumph lay the seeds of future discord. Mortimer's rising arrogance and Isabella's visible exercise of power would soon alienate many of those who had once supported them. The uneasy alliance between queen, barons, and parliament would fray under the strain of ambition and competing interests. Young Edward III, though initially pliable, would not remain a mere figurehead forever. The very skills and boldness that had brought Isabella and Mortimer to power would, in time, provoke the same sort of resentment and opposition that had doomed Edward II. But in the heady aftermath of their stunning victory, these future dangers remained out of sight, hidden behind the veil of triumph and the unprecedented success of their daring invasion. After the fall of Roger Mortimer, Isabella of France was no longer the most powerful figure in England, yet her later years were not marked by complete disgrace or destitution. Instead, she lived out her life in comfortable semi-imprisonment, shielded by her status as the king's mother. Edward III, though determined to assert his authority and rid himself of his mother's influence, did not subject her to cruelty. He provided her with an ample allowance and permitted her to live at Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she maintained a small but respectable household. In the solitude of her enforced retirement, Isabella had ample time to reflect on her tumultuous life. The dazzling victories and shattering losses that defined her earlier years must have weighed heavily on her mind. She had seen the execution of Mortimer, the man who had been her lover, partner, and co-ruler, a brutal confirmation of her fall from grace. Her political power was irrevocably lost, and with it, much of the control she had once so fiercely seized. Despite this, her relationship with her son, Edward III, seemed to recover to a degree. Though she remained distant from the heart of power, there is evidence that Edward treated her with a measure of filial respect, even inviting her to court ceremonies on rare occasions. Isabella's death came quietly in 1358. She passed away at the age of 62, a considerable lifespan for a woman of her era, especially one who had lived through such intense personal and political upheaval. She was buried at Greyfriars Church in London, her remains laid to rest in a modest ceremony that belied the grandeur and scandal of her life. Legends later sprang up claiming that Isabella died mad, locked away in misery, tortured by guilt over her past deeds. However, historical evidence suggests a different reality. A woman who, while certainly disgraced, lived her final years in relative comfort, perhaps haunted by memory, but not by madness. The legacy of Isabella of France is a complex and enduring one. Her actions, especially her rebellion against her husband and the deposition of a reigning English king, had profound and lasting consequences. Edward III's subsequent reign is often remembered as one of England's most glorious periods, marked by military triumphs and a strengthened monarchy. Yet none of this would have been possible without Isabella's audacious seizure of power. In overthrowing Edward II, she helped clear the path for a new, revitalized leadership, even if she did not personally benefit from the long-term rewards. In evaluating Isabella's legacy, it is instructive to compare her to other powerful women of the medieval era. Figures such as Eleanor of Aquitaine and Margaret of Anjou also navigated the treacherous waters of political ambition and familial loyalty, often suffering vilification for daring to wield power in a patriarchal society. Like Isabella, they were portrayed as manipulative, dangerous, and unfeminine, characterizations that reveal more about the biases of their chroniclers than about the women themselves. Throughout history, Isabella's reputation has swung wildly between admiration and condemnation. Medieval chroniclers, writing in a world where female authority was deeply suspect, tended to view her harshly. They painted her as a schemer, a traitor, and an unnatural woman who upended the divinely ordained order of society. These accounts emphasized her supposed cruelty, her betrayal of her husband, and her scandalous affair with Mortimer. The Victorian era brought its own interpretation. Historians of the 19th century, obsessed with notions of moral rectitude and propriety, viewed Isabella through a lens of melodrama and moral judgment. She became, in their retellings, a cautionary tale about female ambition and passion run amok. Victorian authors often dwelled luridly on her alleged sins while simultaneously romanticizing her story as one of tragic downfall. Modern historical revisionism has sought to paint a more balanced and nuanced picture of Isabella of France. Scholars today recognize the constraints and brutal realities of medieval politics, especially for women. In a world where marriages were political contracts, where alliances could mean the difference between survival and extinction, Isabella's actions can be seen as rational, even necessary. Her rebellion was not merely the product of personal grievance, but a response to widespread discontent and the manifest failures of Edward II's reign. Was Isabella truly the she-wolf of France, a monstrous figure who tore apart her family and nation for selfish gain? Or was she a survivor, a woman who, faced with impossible choices, dared to seize control of her own destiny in a violent and unforgiving world? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere between these extremes. Isabella was undoubtedly ambitious and ruthless when circumstances demanded it. She made bold, even reckless, choices that changed the course of English history. But she was also a woman shaped by her environment. A princess raised in a court of political intrigue, a queen betrayed and humiliated by her husband, a mother striving to secure a future for her son. In the end, Isabella of France remains one of the most fascinating and enigmatic figures of the medieval era. Her life, filled with drama, passion, betrayal, and resilience, continues to captivate historians and storytellers alike. She was neither wholly villain nor pure heroine, but a complex individual who carved out a place for herself in a world that afforded women few opportunities for power. Through her triumphs and her failures, Isabella's story endures, a testament to the fierce intelligence and indomitable will of the woman they called the she-wolf of France. Isabella of France spent the last decades of her life in a curious twilight of comfort and isolation. Having once been a queen who defied her husband, raised an army, and overthrew a king, she lived her later years removed from the political stage she had once dominated. After the execution of Roger Mortimer in 1330, Isabella's world changed dramatically. Mortimer's death severed the final tie to her period of power, and with it, any real political influence she still held. Her son, Edward III, though deeply indebted to her for the throne he ruled from, was determined to establish his authority free from the shadow of his mother's ambitions. Isabella's retreat into semi-imprisonment was not a harsh captivity, but it was a clear removal from public life. She lived in relative luxury, with access to considerable wealth and estates. The castles of Castle Rising in Norfolk and Berkhamsted became her residences. She maintained her own household, dressed richly, and participated in religious observances, yet she was kept at a careful distance from the centers of power. Her confinement was more symbolic than punitive, a polite exile for a queen who had once defied the natural order. In her solitude, Isabella must have often reflected on the tumultuous events of her life. Once the daughter of the powerful Philip IV of France, the wife of Edward II of England, she had suffered humiliations at the English court, been overshadowed by her husband's favorites, and watched as her authority as queen consort was diminished. Her escape to France, the alliance with Mortimer, the invasion of England, and the deposition of her husband had all been driven by an urgent desire to reclaim her dignity and protect the future of her son. Yet the triumph had been fleeting. Mortimer's execution marked the ultimate betrayal. Her son, the very boy she had fought for, turned on her closest ally and, by extension, distanced himself from her. The execution of Mortimer in particular must have been a bitter memory. Once her lover and political partner, Mortimer had risen with Isabella to extraordinary heights. Yet ambition and overconfidence had been their undoing. Edward III's decisive action against Mortimer symbolized the young king's need to break free from his mother's influence and assert his own rule. Isabella, powerless to prevent Mortimer's fall, was left to witness the collapse of the political edifice she had constructed so painstakingly. Isabella's relationship with Edward III after Mortimer's death was complex. Although Edward had removed Mortimer and curtailed Isabella's political activities, he treated her with respect. She was provided for generously, and there is no evidence of personal cruelty or neglect. On ceremonial occasions, Isabella was still acknowledged as the Dowager Queen, and she retained certain honors and privileges. This delicate balance of respect and marginalization reflected Edward's gratitude for his mother's earlier actions, tempered by the necessity of maintaining his own independent authority. In 1358, at the age of about 63, Isabella of France died. Her death did not cause political ripples. By then, she had been absent from the political stage for nearly 3 decades. She was buried at Greyfriars Church in London, her funeral attended with the honors due to a queen. Tradition holds that she was interred wearing the habit of the Poor Clares, a Franciscan order of nuns, suggesting an image of final repentance and humility, though this detail, like much about Isabella's later life, may owe more to legend than fact. In the years following her death, legends began to grow around Isabella's memory. Some chroniclers and later writers described her as descending into madness, haunted by guilt over her husband's murder and Mortimer's execution. Tales circulated of a queen who had lost her mind, who spent her days repenting her sins. However, these accounts are of dubious authenticity. No contemporary source records her madness, and the stories likely arose from a mixture of misogyny, fascination with her dramatic life, and a desire to create a moralistic narrative. The image of Isabella as a tragic, broken figure fits neatly into the medieval love of moral tales, where pride and ambition inevitably led to downfall. But a closer examination suggests a different story. Isabella, in her later years, seems to have lived a life of relative peace and dignity. She withdrew from politics, but she did not descend into madness or disgrace. If anything, her retreat suggests a pragmatic acceptance of her altered circumstances, a survival strategy in a world that often crushed those who fell from power. Isabella's impact on English history cannot be overstated. Her rebellion against Edward II fundamentally altered the course of the monarchy. Without her decisive actions, Edward III might never have secured the throne as he did, nor been able to reign with the strength and effectiveness that marked his rule. Isabella's insurrection weakened the idea of the divine right of kings in England, showing that a monarch could be deposed for misrule. In this, she paved the way for future constitutional struggles between the monarchy and other forces within England. Edward III's powerful reign, celebrated for military successes such as the early victories of the 100 Years' War and a strengthening of royal authority, was built on the ruins that Isabella had helped create. By removing Edward II, Isabella cleared the path for a rejuvenated monarchy. Her actions ensured that England would not remain under the rule of an ineffectual king whose favorites had alienated the nobility and undermined governance. When compared to other formidable women of the medieval era, Isabella's story reveals both common threads and unique aspects. Like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who navigated the treacherous waters of political power across 2 kingdoms, Isabella demonstrated intelligence, resilience, and an acute sense of political opportunity. Both women were criticized in their time for stepping outside the expected roles of passive queens. Similarly, Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, would later fight fiercely for her son's rights during the Wars of the Roses, showing the same maternal ferocity that drove Isabella. Yet Isabella's actions were more shocking to her contemporaries because she not only rebelled against her husband, but also oversaw his deposition and replacement. Such an act struck at the very heart of medieval concepts of kingship and queenship, making her reputation particularly controversial. Throughout history, Isabella's reputation has shifted dramatically. Medieval chroniclers often painted her in harsh colors, emphasizing betrayal, ambition, and sin. In their accounts, Isabella was frequently depicted as an unnatural woman, guilty of both political rebellion and sexual misconduct, a dangerous combination in the medieval moral imagination. These chroniclers, writing from a male-dominated perspective that valued female submission, found Isabella's actions deeply disturbing and sought to portray her as a cautionary example. In the Victorian era, historians continued to view Isabella through a critical lens, though their focus shifted somewhat. Victorians, obsessed with morality and propriety, were scandalized by Isabella's affair with Mortimer. Her rebellion was seen as both a personal and a political transgression. Victorian writers often depicted her as a sinister figure, the infamous she-wolf of France, whose ambition and passion led to ruin and disgrace. The nickname itself evokes images of unnatural cruelty and savagery, reinforcing the idea of Isabella as a threat to the moral and social order. Modern historical scholarship, however, has sought to reassess Isabella's legacy with a more balanced view. Historians today are more inclined to understand the constraints and pressures she faced. They recognize that her actions were not merely the products of ambition or lust, but rational responses to a situation in which her husband's incompetence endangered her son's future and her own position. Modern scholars are more sympathetic to the difficulties Isabella faced as a queen married to a man who sidelined her in favor of his favorites, and who allowed the kingdom to slide into chaos. Rather than seeing Isabella solely as a villainess or a scheming adulteress, contemporary historians view her as a woman navigating the brutal realities of medieval politics. She was not unique in using personal alliances to achieve political goals. This was a standard method of operation for nobles and royalty alike. Her relationship with Mortimer, while scandalous to later moralists, was in many ways a practical partnership aimed at securing power and stability. Thus the question remains, was Isabella truly the she-wolf, or was she a survivor in an unforgiving world? The truth, as with most historical figures, lies somewhere in between. Isabella was certainly ruthless when necessary. She made decisions that led to death and upheaval. Yet she was also a woman operating within a narrow set of options, using the tools available to her to secure her son's inheritance and her own survival. The she-wolf epithet says more about the fears and prejudices of later generations than about Isabella herself. Her story is one of resilience, strategic acumen, and determination. In a world where women were expected to be obedient and powerless, Isabella seized the reins of history for a brief moment, changing the course of a kingdom. That she paid a personal price for this, isolation, the loss of love, and the tarnishing of her name, only underscores the harsh realities faced by women who dared to wield power in the medieval era. Isabella of France remains a fascinating and controversial figure. Her life invites reflection on the nature of power, gender, and survival in a world that offered few protections to those who fell from favor. Isabella of France's story has captured the imagination of writers, playwrights, filmmakers, and historians for centuries. From the moment she stepped onto the historical stage as the Queen of England, she became a figure of intrigue and controversy. Her life, defined by political rebellion, royal marriage, and her role in one of the most dramatic downfalls in medieval English history, has inspired numerous cultural depictions, from literary works to modern television and film. These portrayals, however, are not always rooted in historical accuracy, but are often shaped by the myths and legends that evolved around her character. One of the earliest and most significant literary works that contributed to the myth-making surrounding Isabella is Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II, first performed in 1592. Marlowe, one of the greatest playwrights of the Elizabethan era, introduced Isabella's character to the public in a form that was equal parts sympathetic and vilified. In the play, Isabella is portrayed as a woman wronged by her husband, King Edward II, who is more interested in his male favorites, Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, than in his wife. Marlowe's Isabella is portrayed as a determined and calculating woman who forms a political alliance with Mortimer, leading to the king's downfall. Marlowe's portrayal of Isabella is one of the most influential in shaping public perceptions of her. He emphasizes her victimhood at the hands of her husband's neglect and the eventual ruthless steps she takes to secure her son's throne. However, the play also underscores her manipulative and vengeful side, presenting her as both a tragic and a calculating figure. This dual portrayal of Isabella as both a wronged queen and a ruthless conspirator has persisted in many later depictions. The legacy of Isabella in literature did not end with Marlowe's play. Over the centuries, her story has been revisited by novelists, dramatists, and poets, each reinterpreting her character through the lens of their respective eras. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Isabella's narrative became even more sensationalized, as her life was increasingly depicted as a tale of female ambition and power. For instance, in the Victorian era, the romanticized and often sensationalized versions of her life focused on her passionate affair with Mortimer and her bold political maneuverings. These portrayals often emphasized Isabella's rebellious nature, casting her as a villainous figure who was willing to go to any lengths to secure power, including murder and betrayal. Modern depictions of Isabella have tended to explore her life with more nuance, reflecting the evolving understanding of women's roles in history. In television dramas and films, Isabella is often portrayed as a complex figure, both a victim of her circumstances and a powerful force in her own right. One notable example is the British television series The Hollow Crown, 2016, which portrays Isabella in a more sympathetic light, showing her struggles as a queen who was forced to take drastic action to ensure the survival of her son's claim to the throne. In this version, Isabella's character is not simply the she-wolf of legend, but a mother fighting for her child's future in a deeply patriarchal world. Films such as Edward II, 1991, directed by Derek Jarman, also delve into the darker aspects of Isabella's character, highlighting her emotional and political manipulation. Jarman's film takes a more avant-garde approach, presenting Isabella's story in a highly stylized and symbolic way, with a focus on the themes of power, betrayal, and gender. This film, while artistic in its approach, also challenges the viewer to reconsider the motivations behind Isabella's actions and the societal forces that shaped her choices. In novels, Isabella continues to be a figure of fascination, with many authors weaving her into historical fiction. Writers such as Jean Plady and Allison Weir have explored her life in depth, often focusing on the personal dynamics between Isabella and her husband, Edward II, and their impact on the political landscape of England. These fictionalized accounts tend to humanize Isabella, offering insight into her internal struggles and the complex political realities she faced. While these novels do not always adhere strictly to historical facts, they provide a rich tapestry of Isabella's life and offer a more empathetic view of her character. In addition to literature and drama, Isabella's image has been shaped by the myths that have evolved around her. The nickname She-Wolf of France, which has followed her throughout history, reflects the negative aspects of her reputation. This moniker, often associated with her rebellion against Edward II and her role in his deposition, paints her as a predatory, unnatural force in medieval politics. The image of the she-wolf evokes danger and ruthlessness, suggesting a woman who would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. Yet, as with many historical figures, the myth of Isabella as the she-wolf obscures the more complex realities of her actions. While Isabella certainly used her intelligence, political acumen, and even manipulation to achieve her goals, her rebellion against Edward II was not a purely personal vendetta. She was, in many ways, a product of her time, driven by the need to protect her son and her own dignity in a kingdom where power was ruthlessly contested. The image of Isabella as a bloodthirsty villain, as promoted by later chroniclers and dramatists, contrasts sharply with the more measured portrayal of her as a queen seeking justice for herself and her son. The myth-making surrounding Isabella also serves as a reflection of the gender dynamics of the times in which these stories were told. In a patriarchal society, women who took power into their own hands were often vilified, particularly if they sought to subvert the authority of men. Isabella's actions, which included deposing her husband and ruling England as regent for her young son, challenged traditional gender roles and threatened the established order. The image of the she-wolf was thus not only a reflection of Isabella's political actions, but also a commentary on the anxiety surrounding female power in medieval and later societies. In rethinking Isabella's legacy, it is essential to acknowledge the contradictions that define her character. She was, in many ways, both a liberator and a tyrant. As a mother, she sought to protect her son's future. But in doing so, she resorted to ruthless tactics that ultimately led to the downfall of her husband and the destabilization of the monarchy. Her actions, while motivated by a desire to secure her son's throne, were not without consequences, and her reign as regent was marked by both triumph and tragedy. Isabella's story is also a reflection of the complexities of medieval politics. In an era when women were expected to remain passive in the face of male authority, Isabella's boldness and ambition set her apart. She was a queen who understood the dynamics of power and was willing to take the necessary steps to achieve her goals. Yet, her story also reveals the precarious nature of power in a medieval court, where alliances were fragile and betrayals were common. Isabella's rebellion against Edward II, while ultimately successful, was fraught with danger and uncertainty, and her later fall from power demonstrates the fickleness of royal favor. The challenge of judging Isabella's actions by modern standards is significant. In a time when political machinations were often ruthless, and women were expected to conform to rigid roles, Isabella's behavior was not entirely unusual. Her actions were shaped by the circumstances in which she found herself, married to a king who neglected her, surrounded by political rivals, and determined to protect her son's future. While her methods may seem extreme by today's standards, they were, in many ways, the only options available to her in a world where power was the ultimate currency. Isabella of France remains a figure whose life and legacy continue to provoke debate and reinterpretation. The cultural depictions of Isabella, from Marlowe's Edward II to modern television dramas and novels, have shaped the way we view her, often distorting or enhancing her image depending on the era in which they were created. The myths surrounding Isabella's character, particularly the she-wolf label, continue to influence our understanding of her actions, yet they obscure the complexity of her role in medieval history. Isabella was both a victim of circumstance and a master of political strategy, a woman who used her intelligence and ambition to navigate a brutal and patriarchal world. Her legacy, far from being one of simple villainy or heroism, reflects the multifaceted nature of power, betrayal, and survival in the medieval era. In rethinking Isabella, we are reminded that history is often more nuanced than the myths that surround it.